Welcome to the Rimworld mod rundown. We'll be taking a quick look at what you can expect to see from Vanilla Factions Expanded Ancients. For starters, you'll need to own the Ideology DLC, as well as the additional workshop content, Vanilla Expanded Framework, and Harmony. What a beast of a mod to cover today. Whilst on the surface this may seem quite isolated in its additions to your game, the new parts run deep, greatly expanding upon the utilisation of the Ancients faction from the normal game. So what do we get with Ancients? A new Storyteller, a genetics lab that can install superpowers, 50 beneficial abilities, 30 potential weaknesses, a bench to repair items, unique ancient structures, a new event, a couple of quests, a hidden faction, a new meme with related presets, and 2 new starting scenarios. Now, that is a fair old chunk of moving parts to cover. Fortunately, there isn't anything here that's extremely convoluted or particularly difficult to go over, so let's run through the list and break it all down. Firstly, the Storyteller, Alfred Ancient. If he offers you any sweets, make sure to tell a responsible storyteller like Cassandra right away. Alfred plays in a very unique manner, setting desired population to just 5 and making it extremely difficult to recruit prisoners. For this negative, your colonists will never experience any skill loss, so the only way is up. Managing your colony wealth when using Alfred is going to be essential, as any growth for your base will be met with larger raids, and when the game is actively working against you downing enemies for recruitment purposes, they'll quickly overwhelm you. Make sure you're destroying excess gear and corpses right away. Each body is 250 silver when it's on your map, even if it's in a grave. We'll do the major addition to the game now, as I'm sure it's the biggest draw for this rundown. Gene Tailoring.
You're a laboratory experiment, Rogers. Everything special about you came out of a bottle.
This also ties in with the 2 new quests, a looted vault and a sealed vault. Vaults are the homes of the Ancients, with sealed vaults still brimming with structures and items that you can make use of. Looted vaults will be much easier to get in and out of, but come with a lot less shiny things to take home and show off. Your first vault quest can potentially continue forever, as each vault will contain an ancient broadcasting station that reveals the location of another vault. Rinse, repeat. The only way you can screw this up is if you leave the quest for too long and it expires. If you don't think it makes sense for the vaults to simply disappear after a set amount of time, the mod Vaults Are Eternal has your back, and removes any time pressure so you can explore the uncovered vaults when you feel you're ready. The major part of exploring these vaults is to recover the gene tailoring structures, and boy howdy are there a lot of parts that you're going to need. Each vault has an assortment of these parts, meaning you need to visit multiple vaults to get a complete collection of gene tailoring machines. All of these structures can be minified and carried home, but you can save yourself the legwork with any excess structures you find by deconstructing them and bringing back the chunk of valuable materials they typically leave behind instead. You're unlikely to need, or want, more than 1 lab setup due to its hefty cost. First up, obviously, is the gene tailoring pod itself. This can be used right away if you really want to. All of the additional structures I'm going to mention after this are purely optional, in the same way that skydiving with a parachute is optional. You will still reach the ground after all, you'll just be in a far worse condition than if you played it safe and got some better gear first. The gene tailoring pod uses a new item called Super Nanites to fuel it, which always sounds like a really good sleep to me. Super Nanites. The pod can store up to 5 charges of these nanites within itself and will use 1 for every procedure conducted. Fair warning about these nanites, they are extortionately expensive. You will absolutely doom your colony if you go to a vault really early and bring back all of them that you find. Each one has a market value of 3,400 silver, which to put it into perspective is about the value of 2 standard, healthy baseliner colonists. Not only do they skyrocket your colony wealth, they also deteriorate at a rapid rate when outside of containment, lasting 3 days at best. You can cheese this a little bit by keeping them in a pawn's inventory if you need to, and you can get around both of these downsides by having someone with a high plant skill live on the world map. They'll forage enough food to live comfortably and can hold on to any nanites for you. Just make sure they're geared enough to survive a potential ambush, and if you ever need a quick, easy and sizable boost to any faction relations, these make for a fantastic gift to launch via a pod to any other settlement. Anyway, the tailoring pod, the actual details. We'll keep a running total down the side for floor space, power consumption, and market value for all of this gear. This is the foundation of your gene lab, ideally placed in the centre of a room that will be dedicated to this genetic stuff. If used by itself, it will be able to install superpowers with a 50% success rate over a 15-day period, during which time the pawn will be locked into the pod, similar to Crypto Sleep. You'll have no choice in what powers are granted, and it may install up to 3 maximum, with each positive power granted also applying a negative. That again, you will have no control over. For each power that a pawn has, counting the positive and associated negative as 1 power, the risk of failure with this procedure increases by 10%. So without any additional buildings, you have a 50% chance of success for 1 power, 40% chance for the second, 30 for the third. Failure has 3 potential outcomes. It can go a little bit sideways, granting no powers and turning the colonist berserk, so you'll need to try and bring them down safely. It can go pretty sideways and cause brain damage, dropping the pawn to a single hit point on their brain, meaning you'll need to find a way to fix the horrific scarring. Or it can go entirely sideways and outright kill them. If you're playing with biotech, this death will override things like Deathless from the Sanguiphage xenotype, so consider the risks of using this pod very carefully, and make sure you have your contingency plan around when RNG throws a spanner in the works. Before we boost this pod, let's make sure any super nanites we have aren't falling apart overnight. The super nanite containment is the only shelf that will stop them from degrading over time, storing just a single dose, unless you're using something like Ogre-Stack. These will chew through power and colony wealth if you want to keep a large amount of nanites on hand at any time. Given that the tailoring pod holds 5 doses, I'm going to play somewhat conservative in how many I keep around the colony, and say that we're going to use just 3 of these. That's enough to keep more than 50% fuel for the pod itself on hand at any time. You really don't want to be a loot goblin with these things though. Getting into the habit of letting excess nanites go is important. They'll only bring you pain otherwise. Now to start boosting this pod. Firstly, we have the Super Nanite Injector Pump. Each one of these buildings will lower the time needed to complete the procedure by 1 day, capping at 10 connected. As we already know from things like Biosculptor pods, anything that can lower the time needed to complete a procedure, especially when counting in entire days, is worth its weight in gold. Obviously the offset to this is that you'll be getting through a lot more super nanites if it's only taking 1/3 of the time to complete the procedure, so you're going to need to do more runs to vaults to collect them. On the plus side, you can get through those nanites quickly, so you aren't clogging up your colony wealth by just sitting on them as you're waiting for them to be used. From here we've got another small structure, the simulation drive. You can already see how pricey things are starting to get, and we've got a long way to go. Each one of these will lower failure chance by a single percentage, with the pod supporting up to 10 connections. It isn't that hard to get a complete set of these though, as things like injector pumps and simulation drives are standard spawns in most vaults and appear in bunches of 2 to 4. Next we have the Super Nanite Dialyzer. Packing a little more punch than a simulation drive, each of these cuts down the failure chance by 5%, with a pod supporting 2. Now we're also going to have to start playing Tetris with the layout of the gene tailoring lab. The pod does have more connection range than you might think though, with smaller buildings having a much greater reach, getting shorter as you progress to the larger enhancements. These buildings also don't have a connection limit, so if you're saying to hell with the budget, you can easily have a room with multiple pods that are all benefiting from these boosts. Now we've got the Super Nanite Centrifuge, reducing failure chance by 5%, and again allowing up to 2 per pod. By this point we've already got 24 connected buildings, and some of them are about to get bigger.
Bigger!
Jeff?
Bigger!
Jeff?
Bigger!
Jeff!
The Genome Stabilizer is a jump and a half, with each one lowering failure chance by 10%, and pods supporting a pair. By now, if you've got all of these parts connected, you're at the highest speed and success chance, but there's still a few things we're missing. We can go further. The Genome Macro Thermometer and the Stabilized Mucus Inducer both have the same effect, adding an additional ability slot to your colonists when undergoing multiple gene therapy trials. This is what allows you to reach your 4th and 5th superpower slots. The buildings are unique in their effect, however, so you will need one of each, not two of the same. Now we've got the Nanotech Retractor. This unlocks a new feature for your pod, the ability to perform an operation to remove a weakness. This procedure is inherently more risky than adding a superpower to your colonists, with an additional failure offset of 30%. So if you want the best chance to remove a weakness, you're going to need to perform these operations whilst your pawn still has a low amount of powers imbued. Getting someone all the way up to level 5 and then deciding it's time to try and yank out negatives is going to result in disaster. Catastrophic disaster if they have extremely potent combat powers and you roll the berserk failure on them. You might want to consider weapons expanded non-lethal for the dart guns, to bring down your angry superheroes in the safest possible way. Just run the hell away once the anesthetic has been applied. Finally, we have the Nanite Sampler, which I go as far as to say is essential before you start sticking things inside your colonists.
Phrasing!
Obviously!
This offers a choice between which positive and negative combo you would like. It's a binary choice, you don't get to mix and match the offered positives and negatives, but this does allow you to avoid entirely useless rolls with some folk, given what work they may or may not do, or to avoid totally crippling negatives, as we'll go over next. Before we do go over these powers though, let's quickly address the setup's cost. For just the structures, not counting any of the loaded or the additional super nanites that you're going to need, or counting any additional tailoring pods that you may want to install, you are looking at 38,815 silver and 5,700 watts of power, which goes a long way in saying this stuff is pretty clearly late game oriented, especially when compared to something that is arguably more reliable and far more cost efficient than this, which is the gene assembly and xenogerm system from biotech. You'll still be adding in positives and negatives to balance out a colonist's power, but you've got direct control over what happens, with no risk of death, no lengthy setup process to gather all of the equipment needed, although you are still going to need time to farm gene packs, but it doesn't come with a silver cost that rivals an entire 1-year colony setup for a single room of structures. On the other hand, xenogerms are never going to be as strong as some of the potential powers that you can unlock, even sanguiphage stuff. Xenogerms are just a little bit more reliable. This can make the superpower system fall into that somewhat nasty niche of a win more option. By the time you've got your colony to the point you can make use of it, chances are you're already nigh unkillable anyway, so the biggest risk to the colony is you, killing your own colonists in an attempt to turn them into a super soldier and botching it.
I botched that one. Oh, that's a botch job.
So what potentials do these super soldiers have? You've got 50 positive options and 30 negatives. Strap yourselves in because we've got a lot to cover now. Remember that with every power you gain, you will be taking a negative too. It's going to take a second, more dangerous procedure to remove the downside. First up, we've got Super Jump, which fortunately comes with Super Knees too. This allows your pawn to rapidly jump about 10 tiles with only a 3-second cooldown. It's not massively powerful, but it's highly spammable. Useful for getting a pawn with a dangerous utility item in and out of danger, whilst keeping them untargetable mid-flight. Super Strength is going to double your melee damage, as well as doubling carrying capacity on the local map and in a caravan. This will allow a standard baseliner to haul up to 70 kilograms, making them very useful for large-scale construction projects around the base or a raid when scavenging vaults. Bulletproof Skin is a bit of a double-edged sword. All sharp damage is now converted into blunt damage, allowing you to focus your defences towards blunt armour and only blunt armour. The issue is, this isn't changing sharp damage to blunt damage in the same way that hitting armour would have done. It isn't halving it and turning it into blunt. Pause if you need to read the armour math here. Bulletproof Skin is just changing it to straight blunt damage, hitting exactly as hard as it would have if it was sharp damage. So you have a better chance of halving the income damage the majority of the time if it was hitting your sharp armour, as sharp is easier to protect against. The upside is obviously that if you can get your blunt armour high, it will protect against all eventualities. Martial Artist gives your colonist plot armour. Increasing their melee dodge and hit chance to 100%. You won't be able to dodge bullets, but you can solo entire raids of melee-focused tribals. The chance to hit being 100% also lets you do some really interesting things with stuff like Venom Fangs and Talons, as now you can safely stack up that toxic build-up without any risk of retaliation. Speed Burst makes kiting enemies a total breeze, quadrupling move speed and halving melee attack cooldown for 30 seconds on a mere 1 hour cooldown. To make the most use of this melee attack bonus, you're really going to need something like Martial Artist as well, to make sure that you're not just running into combat and then being absolutely battered and swamped by a mob of enemies. Super Speed is a passive bonus to move speed rather than an active ability, providing a constant 150% effect. This is more beneficial for work and day-to-day colony life, as well as being easier to utilise on a ranged combatant, as you'll never hit that cooldown window. But it is worse for a melee fighter, as that lack of attack cooldown typically results in the colonist charging into combat ahead of everyone else and then getting slapped around a bit, rather than blending through enemies with rapid swings. Glory Kill is an active ability with a huge 5-day cooldown. It's also the only thing that this entire mod has an option for, which is disabling the Glory Kill music. This will insta-kill any enemy next to the colonist by ripping them limb from limb, so it's great for a massive target. The issue is you need them to be an enemy, so before you can rip a Thrumbo in half, you need to stab them and make them aggressive, not just retaliatory, actually angered. Only then will the button light up so you can cue the music. Plasteel Skeleton removes all risk of damage to bones from cracks, but this does not make them immune to damage entirely. Your pawns can still be shot in the femur, for example. They're just far less likely to receive damage to their bones from around 90% of injury sources, things like cuts, crushes, pokes, stabs, arrows or shreds. Gunshots, burns and frostbite are all that's left that could still potentially harm the skeleton. Plasteel Claws remove any need to equip a melee weapon, dealing absolutely devastating damage. With high armor penetration and hitting twice every swing, you want to make sure as much attack weighting as possible is given to these claws, so removing any other offensive options from a pawn lucky enough to get this is the best option. Eagle Eye will give your ranged combatants some options, doubling their weapon range. You still need to consider the weapon's accuracy stat for, in most cases, the longest ranges, which typically leaves things that were already in the hunting or sniper rifle class as your best option anyway. Except for launcher weapons, like the Tox Bomb, which will stay surprisingly accurate over a massive range thanks to relying on their miss radius value rather than a close, short, mid and long accuracy value that a normal ranged weapon does. Weapon Expert is another ranged passive that halves aiming time and ranged cooldown. To make the most of this, you likely want to equip a firearm that uses a single shot rather than a burst, as large bursts of projectiles will typically take longer to animate than the ranged cooldown, especially with things like the minigun, so the pawn will be sat waiting before they can start aiming again, despite their ranged cooldown having already completed. Marksmanship takes all of the pain of accuracy rolls out of ranged combat and just says, yep, that hit, roll for damage. All shots against a humanoid target will hit, regardless of weapon, so this can turn a minigun into a laser. Shots can still hit collaterals if they're obstructing the main target, but they will always hit something of value. Just be careful that you aren't banned for hacking. Assassin is diabolical, removing practically all opportunities to take prisoners. Every swing or shot will hit something important. The tooltip says brain or heart, but it can also hit lungs, kidneys, the liver and the stomach. It just has to hit some kind of organ essentially. What you want here is enough armor penetration to make every hit count and enough damage to always destroy something in a single blow. This is what turns a colonist into an absolute machine. Invisibility turns the pawn invisible for 60 seconds on a 3-hour cooldown. We all know how invisibility works thanks to psycasting. You can really abuse enemies with things like grenades when they can't see you to fight back. Overshield grants the colonist an extremely potent ranged defensive cooldown, acting like an infinite durability shield belt for 1 hour once cast. This still lets the user fire outside of the bubble too, and will even protect against explosions, but not burns, so you can't use this to completely nullify a doomsday rocket. There isn't much of a visual representation about how much longer the shield has left either, so use the cooldown to track it. Once it hits 33%, it'll shatter. Unstoppable is potentially useful and equally dangerous. Providing complete immunity to pain means the pawn with this power won't stop until they collapse from blood loss, mobility loss, or are straight up killed. Colonists with things like the Wimp trait or extra pain genes are annoying because they stub their toe and fall down screaming, but most standard colonists will normally fall down at a sensible amount of damage received. Having them carry on fighting until they're an absolute catastrophe arrival at the ER serves only to get them maimed or dead. Electromagnetic Pulse is possibly the largest AoE I think I've ever seen in Rimworld. Stunning mechs, disabling buildings, breaking shields, it does it all, in something with an absolutely crazy 55 tile explosion radius. This will hit friend and foe alike though, so be careful that you're not nuking your own base with it. Electricity Blast doesn't work quite as you might expect if you've been using Psycast Expanded. Rather than instantly chaining down a line of enemies, it creates a small AoE of electricity around the first target, then jumps, and rinses and repeats, having almost a metronome quality. Absolutely fantastic for shattering a large amount of shields on enemy raiders and stunning every mech imaginable. You just need to get a good feel for how long it's going to take to work its way across a large group of enemies. Summon Lightning is what Flash Storm wishes it was. Extremely pinpoint in its delivery, this brings down multiple strikes that will burn and immolate targets in a small AoE, with a really decent range and only a 3-hour cooldown. You can easily use this on raiders that are preparing to attack and have it ready to fire again by the time they've reached your walls. Fire Breath allows the colonist to spit flames, somewhat similar to an Impid with a few key differences. Firstly, it doesn't produce any fuel on the ground when used, so you won't be able to start fires on things like stone or steel flooring. To make up for this, it has a larger range and hits a much wider area of effect. The cooldown is also much shorter, needing only 3 hours to recharge compared to an Imp's 5 days. All in all, not bad, as the damage it kicks out is pretty chunky for a burn too. Ice Breath has a graphic that is all kinds of broken, just like the strength of the ability. Despite the visual for this being massive, it has a very thin line of damage. However, it instantly applies 70% hypothermia and a hit of frostbite. The amount of hypothermia is immediately enough to drop an enemy to the floor. You just need to make sure that targets are all in a single file line and you're aiming at the furthest possible enemy to hit everybody in between. Acid Spitting lets you barf a small AoE of highly corrosive acid that'll stick to any enemy caught inside it and deal constant burn damage to them whilst the effect is present on their health tab. This works well against all xenotypes that are fragile or extra sensitive to pain. Against normal enemies, you'll likely want to pair it with something that amplifies pain, like tear gas, to make the acid have any meaningful impact in bringing them down in a reasonable time. Fireball is an extremely fast moving projectile, hitting a smaller area than Flame Breath but with a much faster cooldown, taking only 30 seconds to recharge. This can be really useful to quickly interrupt an enemy, providing you're on the ball anyway. The impact provides enough ignition to the target to stop them aiming a dangerous weapon and causing them to run around trying to put themselves out. Laser Eyes is the offensive power that you really want. Awesome range, good old reliable blast damage and a large AoE, a mere 1 hour cooldown and a pretty sick graphic. While it doesn't exactly do anything new or groundbreaking, it's really cool to use. Super satisfying to laser someone in the face. Psychic Shock gives you an active ability of the same name, working like a lance without the risk of melting the target's brain. It does have less range than the lance, but its offset is only having a 1 hour cooldown, for a 3 hour effect duration that essentially lets you pick any non-psychically deaf pawn that you'd like to take prisoner. Super useful and surprisingly flexible in its utility. Telepathy will give you 2 active abilities, both with a range of 20, a very fast cast speed and a 1 hour cooldown. These cooldowns aren't tied together either, so casting one won't lock you out of using the other. This is great to have around for prisoners that have a mental break and decide that they want to try and get themselves killed in a riot, to stop your local psychopath slaughtering prisoners because they ate without a table, or to turn a raider that rocked up with a doomsday rocket launcher against their own friends. Really useful. Self-control is an active ability that will only appear when the pawn with this power suffers a mental break, allowing you to cast it and immediately snap them out of it. Once used, it'll take 2 days to come back off cooldown, so make sure you're quickly addressing the colonist's mood so they don't break back down again. Self-resurrection is extremely powerful. You just need to make sure you've got your stockpile and corpse handling settings ready to deal with it. Once the colonist with this ability dies, as long as their corpse remains, regardless of the severity of damage to their body or any parts, they need 3 days to spring back to life. Unlike the Deathless gene on a Sanguiphage, this does work with the gene Tailoring pod, so rolling this as one of the first potential superpowers will let you throw them in repeatedly to remove any weaknesses. If it fails and they die, don't worry. If it fails and they get brain damage, just finish them off and try again. If they go berserk, you can kill them in the process of trying to knock them down and it doesn't matter. An awesome power for sure, just make sure their body isn't left anywhere near open flames or accidentally cremated, or butchered. Regenerating limbs does what it says in the tin. It makes organs and limbs grow back, slowly, over time. This unfortunately won't do anything to get rid of scars. You can get around that by removing the scarred limb entirely and letting the whole thing grow back, but it won't work on things like a brain scar, because despite what some of the population may make you believe, you can't walk around without a brain. On the plus side, this makes this colonist become a reliable organ farm. Free kidneys and lungs for everyone. Just be aware of the pretty hefty penalty to pain, part efficiency and beauty while the regeneration process is in effect. Regeneration is a different effect that amplifies injury healing factor tenfold. Whilst it can't heal scars or regrow limbs, it can pair with stuff like super fast wound healing to make its effect even more pronounced. With enough armor, and if managed correctly, you can regenerate faster than enemies can harm you. You just need to be extra careful about the potential of attacks that would remove limbs, as you won't be able to staunch the bleeding from things like missing fingers and toes, so eventually they're going to pass out from blood loss regardless of how fast you're fixing standard cuts and bruises.
Oh, those bullets are like super fast.
Redundant stomach is a really strong positive if you can combine it with gene modding. It makes the food bar automatically fill rather than drain, regardless of metabolic efficiency, so you can stack some really good bonuses onto the colonist without needing to offset it with negative genes. The only downside to this is that they don't eat anymore, and for most folk, a meal buff is going to make up a pretty reliable chunk of their mood bonus, so you'll need to force them to eat if you want to keep that buff active on them when they're getting close to a breakpoint. Loner allows the colonist to restore their recreation need if left alone in a room, as they're able to meditate whilst working, provided that nobody disturbs them. And yes, I said meditate. Whilst this effect isn't obscenely powerful, it does allow you to force a pawn to work almost all day, stopping only to eat or sleep. Dark Vision is a unfortunate role, as it's something that many xenotypes already have for practically no metabolic cost, removing the penalty for standing in darkness to both mood and stats. Animal speech is a useful ability to have on certain biomes, being able to either calm down a single man-hunting animal or to tame a neutral animal once every 24 hours. If meat and leather are hard to come by on your tile, you should be using this for the bonus yield when slaughtering an animal rather than just hunting them. It also makes events like Wandering Thrumbo even more valuable. Heal Others is bonkers strong. Whilst it can't regrow a limb or cure an illness, it can mend any wounds and it fixes permanent scars, allowing it to reverse any brain damage caused by the gene tailoring pod and letting you try again. For something that only has a 24-hour cooldown, it's got some really good potential, especially when you can cast it in the middle of combat and completely fix a battered and bloody pawn, saving them from another hit that might be lethal. Empathy bestows the ability to buff another colonist's mood by 16 for 24 hours, with the same cooldown. This is great for pushing folk towards an inspiration, or keeping them out of dangerous break territory. You can also repeatedly throw it onto someone if the Moral Guide's counsel ability is on cooldown or failed, giving you another chance to use it for the better impact and duration. Celebrity will fix the majority of others' opinions towards the colonist, making all of their interactions kind words when speaking to others and doubling the positive attitudes of others towards them. Of course, if they're butt ugly or just an asshole with traits like misandrist or misogynist, you can't always fix it.
There's no cure for being a cunt.
Efficient Builder is a funny bit of RNG. It's only going to be useful if it lands on somebody with a good construction skill to begin with. It'll grant them a 50% chance to recover 25% of the resources used to build something. Whilst this is nowhere near as impactful as some of the other superpowers, getting a bit of plasteel or components refunded every now and again isn't awful, it just isn't that fun. Masterful Craft is another passive that requires the pawn to have the ability to do crafting jobs, preferably with a bit of passion. This makes anything created by them come out at 2 quality levels higher than it would normally, and yes, this works alongside the production specialist as well, meaning anything made at good quality would become legendary. Expect your colony wealth to skyrocket if you want to make use of this, as decking everybody out in orange quality gear very quickly bloats your colonists' value. Genius Intellect boosts research speed by 300%. With standard health stats and a capped intellectual skill, this can push a research speed up to 714%. If you throw on some better arms, eyes, and a neurocalculator, you'll hit 945% research speed. A colonist with this setup will breeze the entire research tree in under a year. Super Learning is more of a useful skill all around, especially on someone that's lacking in any real passion. It boosts global learning speed by 300%, bringing a standard skill up to 105% speed, a normal passion to 300, and a burning passion to 450. This can go a long way in filling the gaps in a colonist's knowledge if they happen to roll another power like Masterful Craft with no passion in crafting, allowing you to better utilise all of their earned power. Cold resistance makes you completely immune to any negative temperature effects, sleeping in the cold, frostbite, hypothermia. It gives you a temperature tolerance that is almost 4 times lower than it's even possible for the game to go. Heat resistance does the same for fire as cold resistance did for ice. 1000 degrees of heat comfort, 0% flammability, no more slept in the heat or sweaty debuffs, and 0 risk of heatstroke. This allows you to do some hotbox shenanigans whilst keeping the colony inside with the enemy, to make sure they aren't able to break out and keep the inferno raging. Blast resistance is the most straightforward of these by far, making the colonist completely immune to explosions. This is where in-game knowledge of the type of damage that's being fired at you is kind of important though, especially if you've thrown in a lot of modded weaponry. Anti-grain shell? No problem. Some weird mech mortar shell that you've added though? Technically that deals damage like a charge weapon, maybe not blast. Toxic resistance is similar to dark vision, in that it's a bit of a letdown. You can get this effect from genes, and that will make you immune to toxic grenades too. Definitely one of the weaker powers to roll. Psychic resistance is another dud power. Whilst being immune to psycasting and drones can be a benefit, this is also a negative. They won't benefit from psychic soothe pulses, they can't be buffed by psycasting, and bearing in mind that psychically deaf, which this effect is replicating, is actually seen as a negative effect in Xenogenes, giving you a positive boost to metabolic efficiency. Master Hacker sounds pretty meh. It's potentially one of the strongest abilities when used alongside the majority of Ancients content. It makes all hacking actions instant, which in base game has relatively few interactions. However, with Ancients, this allows you to instantly open secure doors when venturing into a sealed vault, turning what could be a multiple day expedition into something that's completed in under 6 hours. You get in, get the gear you need, and get out. Rinse, repeat. Potentially one of the best resource earning abilities that the entire lineup of powers has to offer. Do not sleep on Master Hacker. Promising Candidate is the dream first pick for an ability. Removing all risks of using the pod, it's guaranteed to let you remove all weaknesses and get 4 additional powers with no risk at all. Knowing how the RNG rolls work though, you can fully expect to only be offered the most uninteresting powers if you get this first. Matter phasing allows the user to walk through walls for 10 seconds before needing to go on a 1-hour cooldown. If you get yourself stuck in a wall, simply recast this ability when it becomes available again. This will allow you to easily scope out enemy bases whilst avoiding turret fire, or bait enemies into behaving strangely by pulling them back before slipping through a wall and resetting their pathfinding, giving you a chance to split groups into smaller, more manageable clusters. Metamorphosis is 100% a trap. Or I'm an idiot and I'm missing what it's supposed to do, or it's straight up broken? I really don't know. You get the ability to turn into a turtle and a warg, both of which have a 2-day cooldown and last 60 seconds when cast. So you look at it and think, the turtle's going to be for tanking and the warg is for attacking, right? No. Metamorphosis just changes your visual and drops your manipulation to 0%. Armor doesn't change, melee attacks get worse because of the loss of manipulation, and even if you do attack someone, it still says you're swinging with human fists and biting with human teeth. So is it purely cosmetic? If it is, why is the cooldown so long? What am I missing here? So those are your 50 positives. Now we've got 30 negatives to cover. Jesus Christ. Blind adds a terrible health effect that caps sight at 0%. So regardless of what you try to do, like installing better eyes or giving a sight boosting psycast, it'll never help. Time to tame a doggo and give them a little yellow vest. Deaf does a similar thing for hearing, capping it at 0%. It honestly isn't awful. Hearing only impacts conversion power, trade prices, negotiations, social interactions, and animal taming and training. If the pawn was already god-awful at social and didn't work with animals, you can easily keep this and remain deaf without a problem. They'll actually prefer being deaf if other colonists have traits like annoying voice or creepy breathing. Mute rounds out this trio by capping talking at 0%. It impacts exactly the same things as hearing, without the upside of removing negative opinions towards annoying colonists. This can stop pawns with negative traits being a dick towards others though. You can easily live with this negative as long as the social and animal skills weren't a priority. Psychological paralysis caps movement at 0%. At least now that colonists are able to crawl, they can drag themselves around the base. But this is easily one of the worst negatives that you can roll. It'll make them completely useless around the base until you yank the negative trait out of them. Professor X wouldn't have lasted very long on the rim. Either you pull your weight or you get in the paste dispenser. Pain hypersensitivity increases pain experience by 300%. This entire negative can be ignored if you install a pain stopper, but that then raises the same issue that the positive power Unstoppable had, making a colonist extremely likely to stand and fight until they're dead. It's still better than the alternative though, of falling over and demanding a trip to the hospital because they walked through toxic gas for half a second. Hypermetabolism increases hunger rate by 200%, turning a colonist into your average American. If you're playing with biotech and the pawn already had a poor metabolic rate, this will stack. At the worst possible impact, it raises food consumption to 7.2, compared to the baseline of 1.6. This will see the food bar drop around 5% every 7 seconds. I know it's the most extreme example of how bad this debuff could get, but it will significantly lower the output and productivity of the affected colonist even at just 200%. Prideful is extremely dangerous, especially if it's on an unattractive colonist or in a confrontational colony that frequently has negative social interactions. If a prideful pawn is rebuffed after trying to flirt, they have a 10% chance to enter a murderous rage and try and kill whoever dared decline their advances. After all, they are such a nice person. It's why they're now calling someone a bitch and stabbing them in the face. This does pair well with Mute though, stripping them of the ability to show quite how oblivious they are about their own behaviour. Bloodlust is another highly dangerous negative to roll. It punishes the colonist with a 50% chance to enter a berserk state upon killing any target, essentially ruling out using them in combat until it's removed, as a berserk break is basically a death sentence. Sometimes going all out isn't the smartest idea. Paranoid is a totally manageable negative in most cases, denting the pawn's mood if they go away from the home tile. So whilst it can be annoying, like if your master hacker rolled this for a negative, making it difficult to use them in opening vaults without having at least one breakdown, for a good 90% or more of the time, there's no complications in having this effect at all. Audacious will inspire an entirely new kind of hate from you. This colonist cannot be told what to do, essentially disabling right-click functionality for almost all actions. Want them to haul something? Prioritise a specific construction job? Help cutting back the blight in the fields? No. This isn't a hard thing to live with, it's just really annoying. Like having a colonist that refuses to do dumb labour. They're inevitably always the one that you select first when trying to force haul something. Callous, honestly, isn't that bad. It removes so many thoughts that having my UI scaled up makes it impossible to display the entire tooltip. The easiest way of covering what it does is pointing at the psychopath trait. So whilst this colonist will now struggle to make any meaningful relationships, they also don't care enough to make rivalries or worry if the colony is in ruins either. They just keep on keeping on. Immature can go one of two ways. It replaces all mental breaks with tantrums, which is fine if it's the generalised tantrum and they go and destroy things in their bedroom. It isn't that hard to replace a bedside table, a plant pot, maybe a wall light. However, if it's a targeted tantrum, you can bet your ass they're going to go for that full stack of components. Chem fuel, HE shells, your legendary marine armour. Just keep them happy. Nothing bad ever happens in Rimworld. Easily bored is another negative that you can kinda learn to live with. Dropping the colonist recreation at twice the normal rate. It can be mitigated by having them in a room close to a rec area, or going as far as to installing a TV that points at their workstation so they don't need to get up to refill the bar as often. The only real issue that comes in with this is caravanning. You might need to consider taking a horseshoes pin with you so they have another source of recreation when arriving at the target site. Easily Enraged needs to be managed almost instantly if you aren't using a mod that makes social fights sensible, like you got me. This sets the colonist on a hair trigger. The slightest bit of backchat, the mildest slander, they'll throw down. If you're running biotech and have xenotypes that are already prone to arguments, or have an unfortunate face, this will turn your base into Fight Club overnight. Honestly, at that point, making them deaf might not be a bad idea.
What happens if, I don't know, I do this?
Sickly will turn your colonist into a bubble baby, so whilst life on the Rim is hard, the germs that survive on it are even harder. This pawn is now at the full mercy of every illness and ailment on the planet, constantly having to develop immunities to things that will affect them and only them. If you can get them a decent immunity gene, they might be okay to fight off the health conditions while still working, as they'll always be discovering something new that they're allergic or intolerant to. Immunological disorder, on the other hand, is far worse. A colonist with this will still get ill at the standard rate as everybody else, but they have absolutely no immune system to fight back with, being hampered with an immunity gain speed of just 25%. Even with a super immunity gene, that's just 38%, making basically any infection or malady fatal. You're going to have to pray that they don't come down with the sickness. Zealot basically stops the majority of colony growth until it's been addressed in some manner, making the affected pawn instantly enter a slaughter state if you have any prisoners in your colony. If you can't afford to risk throwing them into a pod to try and remove this weakness and you really don't want to lose your prisoners, remember that folks without legs can't experience a mental break. So as long as you've got some backup bionics to fix the issue once all the prisoners have been recruited, it can be an emergency solution for this problem. Lustful turns a colonist into one of those guys on the street with a mic and a shitty question. They'll flirt with everyone, constantly, and always be rejected. It makes the entire colony's opinion of this single person plummet, likely leading to a lot of social fights as colonists vent their frustration with their fists after one too many "a-girl" comments. Hallucinations is a really unique negative to have. It has a weird twist that it's pretty fun to keep around and just see the insanity unfold. The colonist occasionally enters a silent mental break. You won't be informed that it's happening to them in any way. During this time, they'll wander around a little and periodically fire their weapon at images only they can see. Of course, this runs the possibility of friendly fire, or hitting something volatile, so it's pretty damn dangerous. Really cool effect though. Unstable will up psychic sensitivity by 100%. Now, is this really a negative? On a Psycaster, this is one of the most insane buffs you could possibly receive, close to wearing a full suit of Eltex. But this is going to make psychic drones flatline their mood. Extreme breaks will be inevitable, and if you have any enemy Psycasters coming in, you're going to need to make sure that you get your cast off first, otherwise certain effects are going to absolutely obliterate them. Extremely Flammable ups your pawn's flammability to 400%, just like the Tinderskin gene, and it can stack with it too. If you get this on a Sanguiphage superhero, it needs to be removed ASAP, otherwise even lighting a match near them is potentially fatal. Toxin intolerance will only matter on certain xenotypes, as many have a baseline of 0% anyway. This also only impacts the base toxic resistance, so you can still buff things like environmental resistances by wearing a gas mask. This really isn't an awful negative, it's pretty easy to work around and you don't need to risk a 30% death chance to try and remove it. Heat intolerance drops max comfortable temperature by 10 degrees. Providing you aren't playing with a nudist colony or living on the sun, you'll be fine leaving this on the colonist and just wearing regular clothing. Cold intolerance raises max minimum temperature by 10 degrees. Again, providing you aren't running around flapping in the breeze or sleeping in a freezer, just wear thicker clothing and call it done. Finicky is another negative that will make you want to reach into your screen and slap the affected pawn, reducing global work speed to just 30%. Now, this doesn't always have to be a deal breaker, as certain colonists can still pull their weight without relying on work speed, like combatants, hunters, socialites, haulers and cleaners. You can even lean into this by assigning them a role like sharpshooter from Ideology that disables most of the impacted work types anyway, and they get a nice buff out of it. Unsure doubles aiming time, which is gross on so many weapons, but not an issue in the slightest if you're using melee. This can also be basically ignored if you're using things like quick draw weapons, as it'll only be increasing that time to 0.1 seconds anyway. Oh no, the horror. Always knows better is my negative, reducing global learning factor to 0% out of a misplaced sense of pride. This essentially caps a colonist at level 10 until it's addressed, as skills will only decay. There are relatively few cases where you wouldn't want at least one skill to be able to advance beyond level 10, even if they're purely a warden or a sniper. Bigot disables the ability to perform social tasks, wardening and childcare. This is another negative that might be a complete non-issue if the affected colonist was notoriously bad at talking already, somewhat of a blessing almost. At least they're honest about their opinion now and people know they're an arsehole. Conscientious Objector is another of those negatives that would fall into the slot of only a negative if you're not already incapable of X. But let's be real, you do not recruit pawns into your colony that are incapable of violence without a very specific reason, so for 99.9% of cases, rolling this is terrible. It ruins whatever super soldier you were trying to make. Egotistical looks at all of these work type disabling powers and says, why not everything? Removing the ability to do every type of work. Potentially tied for one of the worst negative roles alongside psychological paralysis, this relegates the affected colonist purely to the role of combatant or a manual hunter. Given how many positive powers boost productivity or things related to skills, this is a disaster of a trait to take. Avoid it at all costs unless the positive trait is promising candidate or self-resurrection, so you can remove it immediately without risk. And that is your gene tailoring, your super soldiers, your living god creation machine, however you want to look at it. The obvious standout of the entire system is the cost, in not only the time needed to collect all of these parts and run colonists through multiple cycles of injections, but also the power requirement to keep this stuff running and the crippling damage it's going to do on your colony wealth tab. If you aren't actively making use of this stuff, if you're too worried that the results might be bad or you're going to botch a colonist or two, all you're going to be doing is making your own life harder. You're pushing an extra 40 to 60k worth of gear and combatants into every raid. Unless of course you're already over 1 million wealth, at which point go nuts, store as many super nanites as you can get your hands on because it's not going to make any difference. Even if you're not that interested in using gene tailoring in every single colony, it's worth raiding the vaults to deconstruct these machines. They drop an awesome amount of materials. Okay, that's Superpowers done. Let's cover the single research project that Ancients introduces, Mending. This requires machining to unlock and provides access to two stations, a fueled and an electric mending table. Both of these tables have the same default work speed, so using fuel or electricity is purely down to what you have to spare, wood or power. There are 3 builds at the table, mend weapon, mend apparel and mend armour. To mend an item, you can see what resource is required in the item's information window, under the new tag of repair item. You'll typically find that the primary material used to craft an item, such as plasteel for a charge lance, will also be the material needed to repair it. This means that items made from variable materials, like a duster, could be devil strand, hyperweave or plain leather for instance. They're going to require that same material to repair. This makes it so you can't craft a single bit of hyperweave clothing for everybody and keep it repaired indefinitely. At some point you're going to run out of that spare material to patch the clothing back up. In turn, this makes reliable materials far more beneficial. A couple of good hauls of Devil Strand are enough to craft the outfits for your entire colony. Then you can drop the size of the field and harvest enough to make sure that you keep it in tip-top condition, rather than sitting on a stockpile of cloth that's racking up thousands of silver worth of wealth. This is also especially handy if you like your weapons to be in tip-top condition, despite the fact it's changing nothing about how they operate or perform. It's just nice to see an assault rifle at 100% rather than some weird value of 96 because it was dropped in the rain for a little too long. On to the other parts included with this mod that aren't buildable. Ancient structures. These are too difficult for your own colonists to construct, with the only way to obtain them being to snatch them from sealed or looted vaults, or occasionally finding them inside an ancient supply crate. All of these buildings come with two significant buffs over standard technology, which will inevitably railroad the majority of your colonies if you play in a very min-max way, as you'll go to loot these every single time. Ancient devices will never break down. No more arbitrary drain on components because these things just break when they're around the base. Ancient tech is built to last. Not only that, ancient tech was made to work come rain, shine, or solar flares, being not only completely immune to them, but also normally working in an increased capacity during a solar flare. So yeah, this stuff is pretty damn powerful, and it isn't exactly hard to get your hands on either, which is why without a little self-moderation, you're rapidly going to find yourself falling into the habit of starting a new colony, waiting until the first vault quest pops up, and then robbing the place blind.
Evening, neighbor. Low on funds again?
Yes, sir.
Within these structures, you're going to have a lot of functional parts that you can minify and bring home for use in your own base, a host of junk items that you can deconstruct for a few materials, some new walls and doors that are for vault quests or the vault scenario, and a few bits that can be interacted with to produce resources. First up, power-related structures. The solar generator may seem incredibly lackluster at first glance, producing a mere 300 watts at full whack versus a normal solar panel's 1700. It comes to life during a solar flare though, exploding in efficiency and producing 3000 watts, represented by its power bar turning from yellow to purple, which as we all know means epic quality. If you aren't a fan of this needing to be in a solar flare to produce a meaningful amount of power, it does deconstruct into 75 steel and 3 components, which is almost enough to build a normal solar generator anyway. The ancient chem fuel generator is potentially one of the most efficient power sources that consumes chem fuel from all modded content that I've currently covered. A mere 30 chem fuel is going to last 13 days in this device, producing 4000 watts of power, or 8000 in case of running during a solar flare. This also works with a pipe network from Chem Fuel Expanded, removing any need to manually refuel it and making it an absolute doddle to top up the tanks every so often. Next is the ancient geothermal plant, which you'll be upset to hear doesn't get any better during a solar flare, because it doesn't need to. This thing already churns out 6800 watts of power, with a standard geothermal doing 3600, so it's almost double. Not only that, you can control the temperature of the exhaust rather than it being a massive blob of heat, allowing it to safely operate not only inside your walls, but even under a roof, acting as a giant radiator or a cooler. The power creep in Ancients is less creep and more like a pole vault, wearing a jetpack. The Ancient battery is a beefy boy, storing up to 4000 watts of charge. Whilst having worse efficiency than a normal battery, meaning it'll take a good amount of time to fully charge up, it does last for absolute days whilst powering things like deep drills. You can even drag one of these along when raiding a sealed vault and power up any auto doors, allowing much easier access through corridors so you can get in and out as quickly as possible. The Ancient Biobattery Tank is a new concept and it's a little tricky to manage at times. With a maximum power output of 2400 watts, it converts 1 kilogram of mass into 100 watts of energy per hour, so the mass of the person or animal placed in this tank is essentially how long it will run in hours. A 70 kilogram colonist is 70 hours. The rate of consumption is always going to be the same, 1 kilogram per hour, and it'll still produce 2400 watts even if the target's weight drops below 24 kilograms. The main issue with this is reliably getting targets that are downed to be able to throw into it, and compared to the previously mentioned power sources, it's a lot of work to maintain when chem fuel generators could be kicking out 4,000 watts of power. You could easily turn a corpse into chem fuel with a bit of butchery and refining, and that's going to go a lot further in terms of raw power and duration. Ancients get a few basic items, like beds and wall lights. Unlike other ancient things, these wall lights don't appear to be immune to solar flares. As well as those items, they've also got some new recreation bits. A foosball table for dexterity play, and something called an ancient educator for cerebral. The educator provides a small amount of experience in a random skill when used, behaving like a trivia machine to keep your colonists entertained, all without any need for power. One piece of ancient tech you'll actually learn how to build with your own hands is in the Cryptosleep Casket research, and that's the ancient Cryptosleep Suspender. These are pretty easy to nab from the vaults anyway, so you can deck out a hospital for yourself, and at just normal quality they provide 110% impact to surgery success, 115% immunity gain factor, and a 15% medical tend quality offset, as well as being beautiful and extremely comfortable, keeping hospitalised pawns surprisingly happy. Compared to a normal hospital bed, it has equal surgery impact, a better immunity gain, and a higher tend offset. However, it's lacking in the birth quality offset bonus, so if you've got a pawn that's ready to pop, they're going to have a better chance in a normal hospital bed, rather than being squished into a Cryptosleep Suspender. To go with your new medical bed, you've also got the Ancient Vitals monitor. It provides exactly the same buffs as a normal Vitals monitor, only with the built-in solar flare protection, and the cheeky benefit that the Ancient buff and normal buff can stack on medical beds, making for a total of 14% 10 quality offset, 4% additional immunity gain, and 10% higher surgery success chance. It just becomes a bit more fiddly trying to lay out your rooms to get both buffs on all beds. A great bit of tech is the Ancient's Hydroponic Farm, combining two items into one to save you the hassle of planning your indoor grow room. Using just 700 watts of power, this 3x3 structure integrates a sun lamp with a hydroponics basin. No more need to awkwardly shuffle 4x1 basins around a spherical blob of artificial sunlight. You can just build a nice easy square room, throw these inside and let them do their thing. Ancients get a couple of workbenches too, the cooking station and the workshop. The cooking station combines a butcher table and a stove together, allowing for both work types to be conducted at a single place, with no cleanliness penalty like the standard butcher table either. The downside to using this is the slightly stunted base work speed, operating at 80% as standard. The workshop follows exactly the same idea with a smithy and machining table, allowing both work types to be completed at a single location, for the cost of the nerfed work speed. You're also going to find ancient coolers and heaters, both entirely unfazed by solar flares, meaning your base will always be kept at the exact temperature you want all the time. On top of this buff, heaters are further enhanced by making them consume less power when running at their max capacity, costing only 100 watts against a normal heater's 175. The cooler, on the other hand, takes a chunk more floor space than a normal wall cooler, and it consumes the same amount of power. The upside to the cooler is that it pipes the hot gases deep underground, so it'll allow a freezer to function with solid walls on all sides without a chimney. Perfect inside a mountain base as it removes the risk of drop pod raids too. There are a couple of defensive measures with Ancients as well. The Ancient security turret has ever so slightly worse stats than a normal mini turret. However, during a solar flare it not only continues to work, but it also drops its power consumption to 0, meaning you can move it anywhere you need. The Ancient Point Defense turret is something you'll need to get a feel for with its range and sightline. It uses twin-linked miniguns to bring down targets and can be told whether or not to fire on 3 different threats. It can intercept drop pods, target ground level enemies, or potentially shoot incoming missiles and mortar shells. Obviously, if you want this reliably attacking things like missiles and mortars, you need to tell it not to aim and fire at raiders, as it'll get caught up shooting normal targets and miss the big explosive threat. Normally, you're going to need to jiggle the positioning of these guns around to get them to actually work when intercepting a drop pod raid in a meaningful way, as their line of fire can be obstructed by a number of things. For best results, try putting them on the north side of your base with a good gap between them and the perimeter wall, so they have enough time to respond to any falling pods that are trying to crash through your roof. Finally, for some bits in the Ancient bases that you're not allowed to take with you. To start with, the Supply Slingshot. This catapults any loaded supplies to a nearby vault, kind of like a pod launcher, only you have zero control over exactly who it's going to. It doesn't matter if this has a roof over it either. I guess it's better not to ask questions as to why, but you're only going to be able to make real use of this catapult if you're using the vault or cargo cult starting scenario, as it does have a couple of benefits. Number 1. You can clear your map of crap that you don't want extremely easily with this. Load it, fling it, forget it. Now there is a minor caveat to make with this, as I'm guessing the devs noticed a lot of people were using this to yeet toxic waste packs away, so if you do that, fully expect them to land back on your own tile in a few days' time. This ties in with the second benefit though, which is this is the biggest gambling mechanic in Rimworld. Whatever you load into the slingshot is counted at its market value, and in a few days' time, you'll get a crate filled with goods of equal value back. This creates a loop. You launch your first pod. Maybe some leftover weapons, a bit of scrap armor, a few raider corpses, some leather, some meat that you've got excess of, and then a few days later you get your reward back. For this example, let's say you got a bionic eye, and a bunch of jade to round out that value. Now, you're interested in keeping the eye, but you're not bothered at all about the jade, so the jade goes back in the pod, along with a bit more meat, some spare rice you had, a raider corpse, all the gear, a random stack of psychoid leaves that landed on your tile from a cargo pod event. Rinse, repeat, with each reward that lands on your tile progressively getting bigger and bigger, until you siphon something off it because you actually want it, and then re-roll what you don't care about. It's really fun. Stupid, but really fun. The Ancient Broadcast Station is something I mentioned around the start of this rundown. It's a structure that you're going to need to hack. Every single vault has one of these and it will lead you to another vault every time. Hacking is going to be a big part of vault life, so you want to make sure you've got a colonist with a pretty decent intellectual skill when exploring them. Large hermetic crates are another thing that you can hack open, containing a lot of resources. Basically a chunky version of the smaller hermetic crates that you'd find at ancient complexes. The Pipeline Junction is a building that can be hacked to gain access to its stockpile of 250 chem fuel. It then takes 7 days to refill, allowing you to repeatedly harvest from it. It isn't without risk however, as using the Pipeline Junction may trigger an infestation event, as you might be disturbing any bugs that are potentially underground. The vaults also come with reinforced walls, strengthened auto doors that will not function without power, and very large locked doors. These need to be hacked or broken to get through. The large locked doors are the primary defense in stopping you from getting into vaults, which is why a colonist with Master Hacker is so beneficial to get. It dramatically cuts down on the time you need to get into a vault and fully explore it. Bashing these doors down is an option, but it's an extremely lengthy process and it's likely to drive you mad with the noise of constant clanging long before it's done. If you're looking to go into a vault and take all the power sources out of it, make sure you're selecting all of the normal auto doors and holding them open first. The last thing you want to do is uninstall, or even worse, deconstruct the geothermal generator and lock yourself inside the base.
You have!
The final hackable part is an ancient supply crate, part of the Supply Drop event. This event feels seriously rare. In my thousands of hours of playtime, I think I've seen it maybe twice. The crate was supposed to land at another vault, but it's gone way off course and ended up in your backyard. It'll self-destruct after a couple of days and hacking it might bring a raid your way. After all, you are stealing somebody else's stuff. These crates are well worth getting into if you can though, containing not only ancient structures but also a huge amount of resources. As well as these structures, there's also a host of new junk items to decorate ancient vaults, many of which actually have functionality with other mods. Toilets, sinks and water filters work with dubs, fuel tanks with chem fuel expanded. There's a bunch of other mods that add storage to a lot of the parts or make the computers functional structures too. Ancients has a ton of compatibility and support out there on the Steam Workshop. In talking about all this, I've mentioned looted vaults and sealed vaults a hell of a lot now. The mod includes 10 vault variations at both a sealed and a looted quality, 20 in total. These layouts are pretty fixed in what's included, so once you start to get a feel for which one is which, you're going to know immediately which way you need to go to reconnect the power grid, or where the food stockpile is, or if it simply isn't worth your time fully exploring the vault, because what you really wanted was the nanite sampler, and this one doesn't have that. So you'll beeline to the broadcast station and try again. The sealed vault starting scenario will put you in one of these at random, with the key thing being here it is a sealed vault start. You'll need to go around reconnecting and hacking your own base open to get started, with some vaults being far more player friendly than others. Like you've got the lovely clean layout of Vault Charlie, and then compared to the absolute disaster that is Vault I. It's very pretty to look at, sure, but it's a nightmare to actually live with. Another important part of this start is that your wealth is nuts. You'll actually want to keep the main doors to your base sealed, keeping the outside away from you as long as possible. That gives you time to scour and organise your base, hopefully finding an extra colonist or two in the Cryptosleep sarcophagus that might have some good superpowers as well. You'll see that this start makes your colony a new vault type, which means that anybody from the new hidden faction included with this mod, the Ancient Super Soldiers, will instantly join your cause, compared to when you're playing something like a tribal or a crash landed start, which will have these folks permanently hostile to you, always fighting to defend their home. The Ancient Super Soldier faction will always generate with the new meme too, Isolationist. Sitting at a very high severity level, this makes recruiting and being recruited forbidden. So you can play with this meme enabled and still get new joiners as a sealed vault start, because those asleep in other vaults are already part of your faction. They don't technically need to be recruited anyway. To make up for being unable to recruit prisoners, you have a new option in how to deal with them: interrogation. Your wardens will threaten prisoners to give up any useful information that they may have, typically beating them about a bit in the process. If successful in their attempts, it will generate a location on the world map to go and claim some loot, normally in the form of a quest similar to a stash of treasure. All prisoners are viable targets for this too, so unwaveringly loyal pawns are actually useful to an isolationist colony. As well as the sealed vault start, you also have one of my favourites, the cargo cult. This plays just like a tribal start with one big exception. You've got a supply slingshot in the middle of the map to make use of. Now, this start can be a little bit buggy if you're playing with things like geological landforms, or if you're trying to start on a mountainous area, so for the sake of safety, it's normally best to land in a pretty flat tile, otherwise you'll risk needing to redo all of the initial colony setup again. You may also want to keep that slingshot safe. Enemy raiders can and will try to destroy it, and you're not going to get another one. It just makes for some really ridiculous situations as your little tribe worships the unknown sky gods, sending away thousands of silver worth of rice and meat after a successful summer's harvest and hunting, only to be blessed with a legendary quality sniper rifle that they somehow know how to use before they've even worked out how to make pants. A really silly start that revolves around you rolling the dice constantly for maximum value. And that is all of it. It's hard to say that this mod is anywhere close to balanced given the insane strength of the ancient structures. I get that they do need to be that way to allow the vault start to work as intended, and the ancient gear should be powerful within the sense of the lore. It just becomes very easy to waltz into sealed vault after sealed vault and absolutely pull their pants down. Because these ancient super soldiers are all spawning in with a positive and a negative power, you often find that they're completely powerless to defend their own base. Not only that, there simply aren't enough defenders to stop you bullying them for their lunch money time and time again. The obvious thing in place to try and stop you from hauling the entire vault away every time is making you have to manage your caravan weight. Only it really isn't that hard with the amount of materials on site. You can just build a pod launcher and fling things back to your home that way, before then launching your raiding party directly over to the next vault and doing it all again. It's all a game of self-moderation ultimately, just as I recommend with Psycast Expanded. These vault structures can, and if you're not careful, will creep their way into every single colony you build with this mod enabled, because the ancient stuff is just better. And it's also one of the most reliable and easy sources of common materials that you're always going to need. Steel and components galore, with a bit of plasteel and uranium in too for good measure. So even if you don't need another geothermal, because you've already used every geyser on the map, It's 250 steel and 6 components for less than a day's work, and that's just deconstructing that one structure. Install with care is the main takeaway with this one. The superpower mechanic is by far the deepest part of the mod, but it requires so much investment that you aren't likely to use it in the majority of runs. But those ancient structures, they're going to be calling to you every single time that sealed vault quest pops up. Thanks for watching, folks. If you have any mods you'd like to see a full breakdown for, or suggestions of mods you'd like to see covered, feel free to leave them in the comments, I might get around to them. I'll be back again soon with another Rimworld mod rundown. Wherever you are in the world, enjoy the rest of your morning, afternoon, or evening. Take care.